All right. Welcome back to Shaggy Dog Philosophy, the podcast. This is the Shaggy Dog Philosopher, and I have a question for you. What does it mean to be smart? Why do we evaluate children? It's two questions, but why do we evaluate children? Now, I never read Ender's Game. I don't know anything other than that Orson Scott Card is kind of a horseshit human being. But why do we evaluate children? My perspective on this actually comes from Japan and comes from anime and video games, especially games like 13 Sentinels. And if I'm piggybacking on what I've already talked about in these last two episodes, I'm thinking about I'm thinking about why we would I'm thinking about how you would go about determining whether you were making positive steps toward evolving a generational genius among your people. And so the question that I immediately have is how did we get it in our heads to, this is assuming it happened. And so what I like to do is I like to reality test by asking questions, assuming that a potentially insane thing is true, and then see if I can work my way into believing that what the consequences of that insane thing being true, or whether I would prefer to not believe. That's how I like to work my way there. And so a question that I have is, if you get it in your head that what you're going to do is you're going to isolate and you're going to stress the children in your communities, some of them, a small percentage of them, and that's what you're going to do. How do you track the results? And so the question that I have is, assuming they did do that, and assuming they did abort it in the early 2000s, like I believe evidence suggests, how did they plan to track us? So let's say that my being an academically gifted marked me out as a potential generational genius. Because I remember taking the IQ test, and I remember it being trivial to me. I remember thinking that this was that it was a test for babies. I would have been in first grade, and I remember thinking, this is a test for babies, like a 3-year-old would do this. It was all shapes, and I was like, this is easy. This is stupid that I'm even doing this. I remember being bored by it, and which is funny, because I took an IQ test recently, and I was bored by it. I know that the speed with which you answer the questions is supposed to be relevant to the results, and like the answers were so obvious that I found myself deliberately taking 2 or 3 or 4 times as long as I needed to answer each question to double and triple and quadruple check my work, just in case going through and answering them as quickly as I saw them inflated my answer in some stupid way, or I made mistakes, and just doing it like that with my basal pattern recognition skills. But do pattern recognition skills make you smart? So what does it mean to be smart? And were they looking for smart kids? Because the kids thought we were looking for smart kids. My peers thought they were looking to isolate and single out for excellence and some particular end game reward that none of us was aware of what it might be. None of us voiced it, but we all thought it. And everybody thought that my being smart was enough of an outlier to literally my whole life. I've been told I'm smart as an insult. I was fired from a job, and then what she told me was, you're smart. You're just too smart. So you got to go. And it's like, we picked up on it. Because the culture in the United States and the rest of the world at large is one of anti-intellectualism. And so if the popular intellectual movement of your era is anti-intellectualism, something happened at school when we were children. Something bad happened to everyone. I wasn't the only person. I wasn't the only person who schools thought was smart and then tried to throw in the trash by middle school. And so I'm trying to figure out what that's about. And now I know I can't figure out what that's about by talking to myself in a microphone. And so really I'm just doing the thing that everybody does. And I'm kind of an old man yelling at clouds or whatever. You know, but it makes me seem human, right? And that's what I'm supposed to do. My civilization hurt me, and I'm trying to demonstrate that we don't get back at our civilization by retaliating. What we do is we get back at the people that hurt us by teaching their children that there's a better way to live. There are so many people in high school that I've reminded myself that it's better not to rub their nose in it. So if we're going to talk about what smart means, I think what we have to, and we're going to ask about evaluating our children. I don't have any children. If I have children, their mothers have made sure I didn't know about it, let's say. In the context of thinking about why do we evaluate our children, I guess a natural next question in the progression, and probably one much, much later down the line, but which my mind goes to immediately, is if there are degrees of thought, one higher than the other, how many degrees are there? And so, experimental physics wants to say there's something like 69 degrees of reality or whatever, and some of them are smaller than the pen of a needle or whatever, and to me that just sounds like medieval philosophy, which never actually did this but has been summed up as measuring the angels that can fit on the head of a needle. That sounds like exactly the same. Sounds like the same language. And so if there are more than 2 degrees of thought, whose responsibility is it to map them out? And should we not have mapped them out before we started genetically engineering our children? And so that suggests to me that somewhere there's a book I have been, let's say, disallowed to read that has those hierarchies. Maybe it's a book that I have read and it just glazed over during that part. I want to say that Blavatsky's Theosophical Society had a map of what those degrees were, but when it gets to cult, and when cults start mapping out degrees, my eyes glaze over, and all I hear is Thelema. I just go Thelema, and that's not helpful to anyone, myself most especially. And so let's hypothesize what some of them might be. There's the animal nature that's pre-ego. And so if we're thinking about this from a historically mystical perspective, we might say the Enkidu beast. maybe even a pre-sexual child. Maybe even a child who's unaware, who's unaware that the sex act even exists. An entirely pre-sexual and virginal child. And so what we're really mapping out is we're mapping out cognitive trauma, is what we're doing. And so what we're doing is we're kind of mapping out the rebirth process of the new age that made it to me. That's how I got here. I've never rebirthed, but I read a lot of rebirth authors. Circa 2005. And so what we're talking about is what I introduced when I asked whether Jesus might be a naif or not. And so what we're talking about is a hierarchy of naivete. And so we're talking about a hierarchy of experience. And so what we're talking about is a hierarchy of trauma responses, is what we're talking about. And so that's interesting because I read a pro-Masonic, as in Freemasonic, book called, what was it called? I think it's called The Secret History of the World, which takes the evolution of esoteric thought and the esoteric understanding of reality and plays it against the backdrop of human evolution as such, and so presents each stage in our coming understanding, let's say, I know that's a forbidden word, but our coming usage of various mental techniques, including, let's just say, like Jesus, he presents Jesus as like inventing empathy, right? So like before Jesus, no human being alive had empathy, and then after Jesus, it's like 100 monkeys thing where more and more and more and more people just have empathy, to the point that from their perspective you can be born as like an empath, because from the perspective of this particular kind of Freemasonic thinking, I don't want to say that all Freemasons are like this, because I'd really like to meet some and hang out at a lodge and get to know you guys a little bit better before I start making broad judgments about you in the modern era. So the idea becomes a Darwinian idea where these different modes of thought, these, you might even call them levels of thought, they're an evolution ascension, right? So it goes from, like, if you take that chart that everybody's familiar with, where it takes like the monkey, the ape, the chimp, and then it has like the progression of stages as it gets more and more upright and then more and more human until it reaches Homo sapien, who's naked and holding a club, or usually it's got like some joke, right, at the end, but we've all seen it, we're familiar with the picture. Well, the idea of higher thought is that our bodies maybe stopped evolving, but there's this higher abstraction above the body. You even see it in the I Am cult's art, where you have the higher person who's like this growing, radiating, glowing and radiating are the same thing, but they indicate different things in my imagery. I shouldn't do that. I'm a writer. I'm better than that. But this glowing being radiating the implication of growth. So growth and change and development, where the human body maybe is no longer developing and evolving into like a higher, more noble or more perfect species, because from the perspective of the 19th century, this is the culmination of the perfection of speciation in general, that we are the closest thing genetically to godness. That's why at the same time they're having experiences like I walked you through with the farmer and the UFO experience, because the Mount Shasta experience is the Mount Shasta experience that Guy Ballard had on, God damn it, the experience of the Comte de Saint-Germain on Mount Shasta. That guy. These names are so hard for me. It's so hard. It's such a struggle. Guy Ballard had the visionary experience that he had of the Comte de Saint-Germain on Mount Shasta, would become a typical UFO experience. So, that leads me to wonder whether there's a common experience, there's a commonality going on there. So from the perspective of these 19th century people, they're thinking about the future, and they're thinking about the evolution of this bodily form and what the next step is. If you're familiar with Tool's music, you're familiar with 46 and 2, and that's kind of answering and presenting the same question from a perspective of Jung's shadow work. And so what they were having is the same kind of experiences that they were already preconditioned to have in the book of Ezekiel and in the book of Daniel, I believe, has a vision like I'm going to describe. And whether either of those books does, and I'm mistaken, Nostradamus most certainly preconditioned all future psychics, all future mystics, and all future would-be cultists like Mesmer to think in terms of having a vision of the far distant future. So what I was thinking about doing for this was walking you through a narrative experiment, much like the UFO experiment, but instead I was going to walk you through the perspective of the Montauk Project from the perspective of the men who wrote the account. But that's, first of all, it's too complex for me to get into the details, and it's not super duper what I want to talk about. Even though they, because of their attachment to, well, no, okay. What I want to talk about is how even they, and I've been meaning to describe what happens to these people as they go along the course of what becomes their ministry. So it works enough. They even, in either book 2 or book 3, even include a vision of the far distant future, and it's dystopic and horrific for children specifically. And what I'm trying to say is that they were in the 1980s caught up in a tradition that reaches back into the 19th century, into the 1800s. And in the 1800s, and then coming into the early part of the 1900s, they were thinking along the same lines, and then after him, in the same lines of the Time Machine. Now I've gone and forgot. I've got somehow I have Arthur Conan Doyle's name in my head for the first time ever. I can never pull his name out of my brain, and I don't like. I really have emotional responses to my inability to pull the names and the words that I want out of my brain when I need them. I have to be not thinking about what I'm thinking about in order for the words to flow, and it can be very emotionally frustrating for me. You've probably already heard me lash out at myself a couple of times in this one. This is hard for me. This is hard. This is almost something I never thought I wanted to do. Or something, rather, I thought I never wanted to do. Does that make sense? So, they're thinking about the future. They're thinking toward the future. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make predictions based on what they understand of their time. Because very frequently these visionary types aren't historians. For instance, when I had my most profound visionary experiences, I was broadly ignorant about I'm learning now about the 18th and 19th centuries, and I'm still broadly ignorant about most of the 20th century. So like my recent past, I was broadly ignorant about. So while I was having terrors about the future and horrible, horrible nightmares about the coming future, and I was allowing relativists and determinists and libertarians to convince me that a coming economic apocalypse was coming, I was broadly ignorant about even recent history. I knew what I knew about what I had seen about the history of my life, and I was intensely interested in 9/11 conspiracy theories, obviously, and intensely interested in the Zeitgeist films, very clearly, and I was traumatized by the 2008 market collapse, and so I read everything that was published about that. Isn't true, but I read everything I could get my hands on, and I watched every single documentary. And so I left 2008 through 2013 feeling like I had a pretty good understanding of at least the time that I had been alive during. And so what's happening when we're having these visionary experiences, rather, I shouldn't say I, because I wasn't yet trying to predict, because I knew that I knew through my interaction with scientific skepticism that what my brain was doing was trying to make predictions with information, with inadequate information. So I allowed myself to lean into the Buddhism and the Taoism that I had picked up by the time I was 20, to just kind of shut off the panic and to biologically ignore the fear and just go about my life. Now, that doesn't mean that my body didn't know and thus didn't surround itself with things to keep the happiness at a +1. That's entirely possible. I totally believe that it did, in fact. But as far as me, I tried my best to remain in a largely waking dream state, allow linear time to pass me by in the cycle of day and night, and when I engaged in linear time, it was to learn about my culture or to read Gnostic literature, not as in the Gnostic literature from the early Christian centuries, right? The first 3 centuries of the Anno Domini period. So I open this with what does it mean to be smart? And so it's interesting because when I go through all the examples in my mind of people using the word smart, they say that was smart to mean he conned me and he got away with it in a way that I can't get retributive justice. Yeah, that's the only way to say that. Boy, that smarts. It hurts, but it doesn't hurt bad enough to have done serious injury. Shut your smart mouth means you've made an observation that was hurtful. And boy, you're smart. You make unwelcome and unwanted observations. So it seems to me that to be smart is to be unwelcome. Now, and somewhat painful. Now, that's my trauma speaking, but it's also, I think it's a fair observation that I think that we don't actually like smart kids. A smart aleck is a kid who shoots his mouth off when he shouldn't, right? And what that means, because adults will call other adults. I was 30 damn 3 years old, and another man in his 30s, he wasn't yet 40, called me a smart aleck like I was a teenager. And I went, dude, I'm 30 damn 3. You don't get to call me a smart aleck. I'm not a child. But what that means is that you've said something to your better. That you, a naif, have said something to your better. Someone who holds a claim to secret knowledge. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And so what it means to be smart is what it means in that apocryphal, probably, story about that one secret cult in the olden times that I picked up from the secret history of the world, in which three boys sneak into a cult meeting and are captured by the adult cultists and left in a room with a knife, and the implication that only one of them gets to leave, and then none of them were ever seen again. None of them was ever seen again, with the implication that the one that survived, who killed his two friends, was inducted into the cult and then locked in a fucking basement laboratory somewhere to be horribly experimented on. And now, from the point of view of the adults, you would want to experiment on that boy, because what are the cultural and environmental conditions that would leave him so hungry for knowledge of what these adults are doing that he would be willing to murder his friends? And then, now they, in their naivete and frankly their stupidity, aren't really taking into account that this is a lose-lose situation as far as that surviving boy was concerned. Either they could kill him or the adults would kill him if they chose not to kill one another. But it's almost a thought experiment played out, and what happens? What do you think the adults would do if the boys decided not to kill each other? Well, that's obviously the solution to the riddle, is to agree not to fucking kill one another for the amusement of these adults. But that's me, a child who woke up from, non-linear dream sleep before he was 6 years old, who had to remind all of his friends, male friends, not to do things that could end in fatality, constantly. But then who also was accidentally putting his brother into fatal situations. I accidentally knocked my brother out of a ladder in a tree once because I thought that the ladder was hooked around a branch, which doesn't even make sense. I don't know how I thought that. And so I just grabbed the bottom of the ladder and yanked it out from underneath him, thinking that I would be able to lift it perpendicular to the ground, because 12-year-olds are fucking stupid, and he just went straight to the ground. Thought I'd killed him. He turned out to be as fine as he was going to be. But, just because you're woke, just because you're awake, doesn't mean that your brain works yet, and that you have properly done the math. My dad used to always say, measure twice, cut once, measure twice, cut once. And what I didn't do in that situation was measure twice. I didn't even measure properly the first time. And that's why you measure twice. Because you should never trust yourself, right? And one thing that I've always found dubious, because of my particular upraising, is the idea that one should have unwavering self-belief. Because as we've talked, belief is trust that a higher power, whether that higher power be God, or that higher power be a king, or that higher power be your manager at McDonald's, that they have everything under control. And so self-belief is Dunning-Kruger. It's the trust that you have everything under control. And if it's unwavering and unquestioning and uncritical, it's almost doomed and certain. It's almost certainly doomed, is the way a good writer would say that, to prove untrustworthy and unworthy of your belief. And that's why so many of us are atheists, is because we go, well, I can't even manage my life. How could a God manage 7.5 billion lives, plus the incalculable immenseness of the universe? And the answer is it doesn't have to, because it is a passive observer, because it is all things and all times at all times. So if it's a conscious awareness of any slice of time, to it, honestly, that's impossible. For it to be aware of any one moment in any one moment, because it exists and is aware of all moments at all moments. That means the beginning, the first moment, and the ending, the last moment, and all of the incomprehensible time in between. That's why Jesus became necessary in the monotheistic faith, because in order to have a relationship with the name, or Hashem, in order to have a relationship with that God, becomes impossible. Because that God becomes two gods. It becomes the God of the theologians, who can comprehend its incomprehensibility, and then it also needs to be the acting God that makes prayers come true for the people at the bottom level. And so if it's an incomprehensibly vast, timeless, incorporeal entity, that how do you have a relationship with that? How do you feel the presence of that when you pray? And so the answer becomes, well, Jesus is there with you, and Jesus is that discorporate entity that speaks to you when you have thoughts that are unbidden, that you don't know are just you. Because as much as I've talked about the pilot, and I've talked about the triune nature as little as I've talked really about the triune nature of consciousness, because we're not talking about consciousness, we're not talking about intellect, we're talking around these things and we're not using those words. You know, there is something else inhabiting this space with us. And so if string theorists can say that there are spaces, that there are dimensions of measurement that are infinitely small, that means that the dimension of space-time, maybe it's not even maybe it's neither of those, maybe it is the fifth dimension, maybe the imagination is an entirely other plane of existence, like an entirely other dimension of being. And what a dimension in this instance, or this nomenclature, name, means is a measurement, or a measurable. There's something else that seems to occupy this space with us. Because we've all had thoughts that weren't ours. We've all had voices in our heads that weren't ours, whether they were quotes from movies that were appropriate memories, whatever, whether they're memories or whether they're imaginary or whatever. They're all happening in the same space, by the same mechanism. And so the Christians came to understand that thing as Jesus. And then in the 19th century, they went, well, no, it doesn't really make sense for that to have been Jesus. Because by the 19th century, Christianity that wasn't Catholicism and certain branches of the Protestant faiths, like probably Lutheranism and Calvinism and baptism and Methodism. I don't know the denominations well enough, I've told you. I didn't know my own recent centuries well enough, and as a child I was forbidden from learning. I was expressly forbidden from ever taking an interest or a curiosity or expressing or exploring a curiosity in Adventism or Jehovah's Witnesses. And so till this week, I've had a massive blind spot, and now I'm aware of the blind spot, but I still don't have enough information in it really to understand what I'm looking at, and that's okay. That really is okay, though. I don't remember what the fuck. 19th century Christianity was Arian, broadly. And so what that means, Arianism is broadly a belief that Jesus was an avatar. It's confusing, and you have to be a theologian to care, and it took me a really long time to understand that I needed to care. And so I've rarely defined it using my mouth. So what I'm learning is that until you use your mouth to define words to other human beings, or at least where you can hear them, you don't really know whether you know them. And that's what they were talking about in school when they told us that we weren't allowed to write a word or say a word until we knew the definition by heart. Really, you weren't supposed to write a word until you could use it in a sentence in speech, and nobody had told you you were using it wrong. And that's actually how you can know what vocabulary to use with your audience. Is if they don't know what your words mean, you need to use lower abstracted words or higher abstracted words. It could depend on your education and how you're speaking. And so anyway, Arianism is kind of this idea, the way Wikipedia, I'm not going to read Wikipedia, but the distinction that Wikipedia uses of where Arius is his name, went wrong was in saying that Jesus wasn't co-eternal with the Father. That's the distinction that modern theologians express, and that's how they express it. Is that Arius said that Jesus wasn't co-eternal with the Father. That basically Jesus didn't come into existence at the same moment in creation as the Father, that Jesus the Son was a creation of the Father, even though before time, in God's time, right? That he is, and so, but that's not interesting. What Arius believed is that Jesus was born a man and lived a man and died as a man, and because of his works he was chosen by God to sit at the end of time with God, and maybe even to replace God now that God was ready to ascend into the next whatever is waiting. God, because kind of where Arius would have been aiming himself and what he would have been thinking about, and the reason he would have been heretical, because this is the other thing that was very much heretical at the time and was popular, because if we're reaching back to episode 1 or part 1 of this, I was talking about how Christianity isn't Buddhist, because Buddhism didn't make its way into Rome, in large part because Christianity got in the way. I may have said that particular sentence or not. I did say it wasn't in Rome. I said it wasn't in Latin. I said that Latin words don't incorporate Buddhist ideas, and there are reasons for that. And one of them is that Christianity got in the way. The other is that Manichaeism is what it was. Manichaeism was Buddhism packaged for a Roman Persian audience, and Christianity destroyed Manichaeism effectively. It's not true. It still exists today, but it's not a proselytizing religion like Christianity is. So Christianity, in effect, prevented it from becoming a proselytizing religion like Christianity was allowed to become. So what Arius would have been arguing is a transmigration of souls, is a hierarchy of intelligence, is a hierarchy of being, a hierarchy of thought, and that God is the highest stage that from our human perspective we can see, sort of like physicists and astrophysicists will tell you today that the universe is actually probably infinitely bigger than the universe that we can observe, that there is universe beyond the observable universe, that the distance that light observably can travel from us or to us is finite, and that there are things beyond that. And so in a spiritual sense, and the spiritual thoughtscape, imaginary abstraction, what they understood in the same way that I'm telling you the 19th century understood human evolution, they understood spiritual growth not to be growth of the body like an athlete, because even by 25 an athlete has reached his peak, and there's another 75 potential human years left after that, and all of those years are potential for development of the psychic and spiritual spaces. How do I want to say this? They understood that even God could transcend above godhood, that Godhead was only the highest level of spiritual attainment that we could reach, but that ultimately, because remember, their Arius, the Arius that I'm presenting to you is not the Arius that you will find presented in many other places. But Arius is competing with Manichaeism. Arius is competing with Hinduism. Arius is competing with Buddhism. Arius is competing with Judaism. Arius is competing with Greco-Roman paganism. Arius is competing with Zoroastrianism. He's also competing with the homegrown Mesopotamian and Persian family cults. and the pre-existing demonologies that are happening all around here, and the understanding of the mystical and the theological and the spiritual realms was very much better developed than we appreciate today, even back then. Like, we think we're very sophisticated in our understanding and our names of all these demons, etc., and the spiritual plane, but we take all of this that we don't just make up out of whole cloth from inspiration from, we take it from these people. So we're either inspired from and we invent it based on these people, or we know what we know because these people knew it. And that's how we know it, is because they knew it. And the way that we're able to argue that it works and it has efficacy and it's good is because it worked and it had efficacy and it was good for them. But that isn't clear and obvious. And it's kind of irrespective or irrelevant to what we're talking about. What I'm trying to say is that Arius understood that Jesus was an avatar of an ascending divinity, an ascending Godhead, and he would have understood his Godhead as the creator of time and space, and that the creator of time and space is alone in the creation of time and space, because he would have understood things as a progression out of one, and one thing is one thing. One thing is only one thing, because one thing is one thing. And so he would have understood everything as secondary to one thing. He would have understood that everything comes out of one thing, because he would have had an esoteric understanding. And so what he would have understood is exactly what we understand when we say the Big Bang, that originally there was one thing, and that one thing had all the information of all things in it, and then that information exploded into all things. And in the explosion was a massive act of potentiality, and everything up until the moment that we occupy was potentiality, and the moment that we occupy now is a potentiality, but we never get to see in normal consciousness, normal states of being, we never get to see the future. We're always beholden to the present. And so the visionary experience feels, when you're in it, like peeping through the keyhole into the future. Now, I've only dreamt about the future. I have never had waking dreams about the future. I've had waking dreams about the past, not occupying the past, but what the past was probably more like than how I've been taught. But those have been significantly less. Those have been revelation, not vision. But even revelation is always described, except by me apparently, in visual terms. Because when you're telling a story, visual terms are better. Like if I was trying to describe the thing I was describing earlier, even when I used my bad glowing and radiant, if I hadn't used visual terms, if I had used words that couldn't call visual images to your mind, even though I was describing a visual image, then what am I doing? And so visual words that I can manipulate to conjure a visual image in your mind are always better. And so saying that you were looking up at the sky and you were thinking about nothing, and then you realized this truth with that truth, is better told by saying you were looking up in the sky and then the clouds parted and you watched it like a movie play out in front of you in the sky, especially if you live in a time before movies. Or actually, maybe not even especially if you live in a time before movies. Like if you're May Otis Blackburn and you're trying to open a movie studio, and then you're telling people that you're having visionary experiences and they know what movies look like, and you can be like, yeah, it was like watching a movie reel in the sky. It was so real and it was so perfect. And well, right, that's delusion too, though. Like that's also hallucination. And so I've been thinking about like what that is a lot, and whether it isn't also what the magical process is. Like so there are things that can happen within the structure of the brain that can cause visual hallucinations. Like, so if I'm going to call Sideways to Astonishing Legends and talk about their Spider-Woman episode, the woman who was haunted by a Spider-Woman, and it turned out that, well, she had like brain cancer or something, and so she had this thing pressing on the visual stimulus region of her brain, and so it was causing her to see things that weren't actually there. Well, that calls to mind the determinist and relativist argument about the mind-body problem when they talk about the guy that had that railroad spike go through his brain, right? Goes up through his eyeball or what, or like up to his eye socket or whatever, through his brain, and completely changes his personality. But the one thing that I notice about that story is nobody ever talks about his perspective, like himself from his perspective. I learned about that in both of my Psych 101 classes. I learned about it in my Psych 151 class, and it's a favorite of every determinist writer, and it's a favorite of YouTube. Shocking education content. My girlfriend's favorite shit to watch. And there's nothing wrong with that. It always grosses me the fuck out. Every time I walk out in the living room, she's watching somebody be dissected or somebody fall apart from some horrible disease. And so from the perspective of the childhood that I was raised in, the Christian Science or New Age adjacent worldview, thinking about these things is how you get them. But it's hard for me, looking at my life, doing the life analysis that happens at ego death. And it's hard for me not to notice the things that I thought about intensely as a child and was sort of gave myself body horror over, things that have happened to me as an adult. Now, coincidence? Totally. Are they things that I was afraid of happening to me and thought were less common than they were and turn out to be extremely common, especially given the choices that I was already inclined to make? Totally. And so what that is, that's called cognitive closure, and that's just pattern recognition of the brain, and it's just a way for us to close, impossibly to close questions that are impossible to explore, which is why, again, calling Sideways to Astonishing Legends, they always scoff at the case closed on Forteana or the weird, and they should, not a criticism. But we case closed because there are things that we can't know. So, like, was dude visited by Indrid Cold? Was there a Mothman in Point Pleasant? Did these farmers get visited by their Nordic-type aliens? Or were they all reading the same literature? And were they all thinking about how cool it would be if the things that happened in their literature happened to them? And then, what I've been figuring out how to get to, did they auto-hypnotize themselves and then give themselves a visual experience? Because one of the most profound visual experiences I have ever had, the visual experience that led me to Robert Longshore, absolutely was a case of auto-hypnosis. Even by the time I had graduated high school, I'd gotten very good at auto-hypnosis. Not that I could do it on, like, not if you could say, hey, auto-hypnotize yourself, and I could do it on purpose, because I have massive performance anxiety, but also that's kind of what I was describing last episode when I said that the magic and its effect breaks down into three parts. One third of the time it happens when you want it to happen, one other time it will just not happen, and the other third of the time it happens when you're not trying to make it happen. And so the auto-hypnosis is something that I was able to make happen frequently without knowing I was making it happen. I wouldn't say it was something that I was... In fact, I would say it's something that once I knew what I was doing, I became very frustrated that I couldn't force to happen again. And I described a little bit about that. So auto-hypnosis is what it sounds like. It's where you hypnotize yourself. And it's surprisingly easy to do. Like, even thinking about the Mount Shasta Saint-Germain situation that Guy Ballard found himself in, if you're... All it takes to put yourself in an auto-hypnotic situation is a heightened emotional state and something tedious and repetitive. That's all it takes. And so if he was up there thinking maybe he was going to have to end it all and disappear and leave his wife and hope that she could collect on the life insurance money because he had a tragic mountain hiking accident, and then he stops. He's been thinking about this. He's heightened. He's emotional. He's about to make a choice. Something's about to break in him. You know, his mind and his self-image and the pilot of him and the something else that occupies this space with us that is more properly understood as the Holy Spirit, and then the very animal autonomy that he's lived in that tells him that self-preservation is everything, drops him to his knees in a heightened state of emotion, and then he looks down at his feet, between his hands is what I mean to say. He's down between his hands on the ground, and he sees a running stream, and he stares at his face in that running stream, and he hypnotizes himself, and he goes into a dream state. And then what does he see? But this guy that he's, become interested in because he heard rumors about this guy from the 18 or the 1700s, and maybe he read books where this guy... I don't know. I really don't... Everything that I know about the Comte de Saint-Germain doesn't want to talk about where, how he got into the popular milieu and then how he got into that popular milieu. So he got into the 21st century by way of Guy Ballard. But I know that by studying Guy Ballard, not by studying the Comte de Saint-Germain and listening to people that have studied the Comte de Saint-Germain even better than I have talk about the Comte de Saint-Germain. So what they definitely don't talk about is how it got into Guy Ballard's head that the Comte de Saint-Germain could visit him too and give him magic powers and right? So anyway, because of his own influences and the things that he was reading, and I'm pretty sure that Mount Shasta is included in the Hollow Earth stuff that was going on with the coming race and that whole literary movement. But that's my point, is he existed in a time when they believed that we were going to be speciating into something that could not breed with us soon, and that the coming superior race was imminent, and that the time machines, what are they called? Whatever, the two different species of human and the time machine when he goes way forward in time, that was imminent. They thought that was months away. They didn't even think in the terms of, oh, this will be like maybe 2 or 3 generations. No, they thought this is happening now. And in fact, they had very good reason to think it was happening now, because West Virginia is a place that exists, and Lovecraft wrote about it. He think about, I know this isn't Lovecraft, but even think about Edgar Allan Poe with the Fall of the House of Usher. The decadent nobility was a thing that was very real. My girlfriend would point to Chinboy of the Habsburgs. So, decadent genetic families and a coming new perfect race, these all felt very imminent, and Darwin only accelerated how imminent we thought it was. And so hierarchies of thought seem pretty self-evident when you don't even have to think of it from a racial perspective. If you start to think of it from an evolutionary perspective, hierarchies of ability to think and ability to conceive, and even just the difference in a logical and education and logic and rationale or reason, and the person who hasn't, just listening to them talk, they think differently, and you can think of them as parallel ways of thought, but one of them is clearly better. One of them clearly has a better effect. It has it's more It's easier to relate to. It makes you feel better to hear and participate in. And the educated person who's able to think logically and speak reasonably is definitely better to have a dialectic with than an educated person who's going to shout when you say something they don't like, for instance. And so from the perspective of, let's say, 11th century Christians, there is a hierarchy of thought between Vikings and Christians, and one of them is better than the other. This is not a parallel side-by-side thing. This is not a Unitarian thing. There's a culture and a way of life that encourages young men to kill one another, and there's a culture and a way of life that encourages young men to not kill one another. And that seems like a pretty self-evident when you occupy the position of a person living in the 11th century. It seems like a pretty self-evident hierarchy of choice. One is better than the other, especially if you're a mother who doesn't want to see her son murdered by someone else's son. Now, if you're a mother who wants to see your son murdered by somebody else's son, or you're a mother who wants to see your son murder someone else's son, you want to live in the lower hierarchy and you think that's better. You do want to live in the lower rung, but again, when you live in the 12th century Europe, you understand that hierarchy of being is the only way that being can work. You understand that there are serfs, and then you understand that there are free people, and then you understand that there are rich free people, and then you understand that there are rich free people, or you understand that there are rich people who have sacrificed their freedom and bondage to the king, and then you understand that there are landed nobility, and then you understand that there are landed nobility who have surrendered their landed rights and bondage to the king, and then you understand that there's the fucking king, right? So there's a whole complex hierarchy of how things work. And so it was very easy for them to understand that you can have hierarchies of intellect and hierarchies of thought, because by the time we're getting into the 1910s, the 1915s, we're 200, 300 years removed from the Enlightenment, sorry, that's why I couldn't get to it. The Enlightenment era enlightened despot, right? So once you've had a few generations, so 60, 70 years, a century of nobility and kings being expected to do a certain thing, and parallel civilizations that are in competition with them, especially in economic competition, more so than military and economic competition is let's say it's an expression of cultural warfare. If you're in economic competition with the people that have an enlightened despot, but you are yourselves an enlightened democracy, it becomes then the voter's responsibility to think at the same level of hierarchy as the enlightened despot, because the voter, the electorate, is selecting the enlightened despot effectively, and so they need to in fact be more enlightened. And this is why you saw men's gentlemen's clubs like the Freemasons explode all over the democratized world, and then in the late democratizing world in Germany and Bavaria, if you want to talk about the Bavarian Illuminati. And so is that why you evaluate your kids? Because I'm going to end up talking about it again and again and again and again, but Einstein was evaluated as a child. He wasn't evaluated as the person who was going to invent physics as we understand it. He was going to be the person who discovered relativity and special relativity. That's a facile point, though, and I'm responding to the facile and apocryphal argument about his childhood education. He was a bad student. That's why he was evaluated poorly. And he was evaluated poorly because by their reasoning, by their thinking, and by their prediction, because what we have to understand is that every present moment of civilization is a prediction of how the future will play out. And like a football team that drafts a quarterback first overall, you can't really know how the future is going to play out until you're in the future. And you can't really know when the future is until the future's the past. So like we didn't really appreciate in the 90s that we were in the dystopia that the 70s promised that we were going to be in until 2010. And then we look back and we went, fuck. We already didn't course correct. So let's just make it worse because the coming end is coming. Because if we didn't course correct and it's this bad, well, let's just live it up. And does anybody else remember between 2010 and 2020? It was YOLO. YOLO and FOMO. So what? What is a smart child? Well, among children, we think to be smart is to have the right answer earlier than the adults expect. A smart adult is someone who has education or training or interest in an evidently tangential or maybe even uselessly parallel skill that turns out to be appropriate to the situation. Like that dad joke about having the exact right screw you need for some random job because you've kept every screw you've ever run across. And you just happen to have one that fits this. And that's how the 19th century was taught to be educated. That's why I chose my farmer. Because when you're competing with enlightened despots, the electorate has to be enlightened. And what that means is that the electorate has to be few people. But then we started chasing happiness, pursuing happiness, running it down, brutally murdering it, taking all of its belongings and leaving its corpse to be found by a small child. And what happened? Like, what actually did happen? All of our pop stars, all of our culture heroes are either the product of sexual misconduct or the perpetrators of it. You can't root for anybody who was famous before 1990. Or, I'm sorry, who was famous before 2010. You just can't. Can't do it. They've all diddled kids. Because it didn't used to be morally dubious. But does that mean what the men's rights activists and the sort of constitutional fundamentalists that I know I must sound like to you, does it mean what they say it means, that it was never bad? Well, the answer is obviously no. Obviously, it was always bad. But what does that mean? Well, it means that Nietzsche was wrong when he said that we need to think beyond good and evil. If his conclusion is that we've already figured out what good and evil are, and thinking about good and evil is slowing us down from thinking about the next stage of human evolution, he's talking, whether he knows it or not, he's talking about transhumanism. And he knew it, because the first transsexuals came directly out of his philosophical school. And so transhumanism is a conversation that belongs in the discussion of intellect and what it means to be intelligent, because transhumanism is an attempt to control what species we become next. It's an attempt to take an intentional and systematic approach toward the next species we're going to be. But I don't think any of us is going to live to see that happen. I think that when it happens, we as a species aren't even going to have been aware of it. I also I also think that it's not for nothing that these John Keel type UFO contactees, as he calls them, the visitations, the contactees, these these keep being from extrasolar planets that were, or extrasolar systems, frequently star systems, just the star system with no real understanding of the planetary system. But then a claim toward no prior knowledge of the planetary system. But what keeps being interesting and what keeps happening is that these people in their visionary experiences keep having wildly accurate experiences of these wildly distant extrasolar planets, like Sirius, like the Dogon people knowing that Sirius was a double star system, which might be apocryphal, but it might also not. And so, like, the people that want to make it apocryphal are doing it because they have no way of incorporating in their scientific, and that is a religious worldview, how they could, because they can't account for mystical or visionary knowledge. Saying I had a dream and the dream turned out to be right when I had a dream of this planet under a star that I never thought about, and then I looked at that star under a microscope and I showed it to you and it was what I said in my dream. What the scientist is going to say is, you looked at it in the microscope, then you told me you had a dream about it, and then you showed me in the microscope. They're going to want to play with the cause and effect and the way that time played out for the experiencer, and frequently they're right. That the experiencer, frequently we misunderstand or misincorporate the actual sequence of events into how we understand things. Frequently we're unaware of our biases, or especially our recency biases, until after they're no longer recent. And so that's what I mean. And what I mean to say is that they keep having these experiences of extraterrestrial species coming to us and saying, well, we were human, and then your time period colonized space, and we differentiated because of the different environments. But that falls in line with what they would have been reading in Darwin. And so if they're having dreams trying to incorporate Darwin into their broadening worldview, that's what those visionary experiences would look like. They would need a third party, a higher order of being, to step in and explain it all to them outside their body. Because the experience that I have where inside my body I go, oh, okay, so that's what this implies, and to be able to track out the paths in my mind, they can't do that. And really, I shouldn't be doing it at all. I shouldn't be able to do it at all. But, that's a part of what's happened to me over the course of my life. Because whether they understand it or not, whether it's a subconscious mapping out of the future, or a imaginary, like the kind of imagination that a fiction writer would go through, and they're just trapped up in it because they've never had a fiction writer's imaginary experience. What they're doing is they're running what's called a thought experiment, because we can't speciate on this planet. We're not far enough away from one another. And so if you understand that, and you think about that from a racial superiority position, and you understand racial superiority to be one where they hierarchied the races by their thought, by the degree to which they had evolved in their ability to think on average among their ratio or xenotype, it starts to make sense that they would begin to say, well, even though, let's just say, black people and Mexicans and Chinese think differently than I do, I can still reproduce with them, and from my understanding of myself as superior to them, I'm still inclined to. So even if I'm having maybe middle thought or lower thought than my own because I believe they're biologically or genetically incapable of the thought that I am capable of, because they have their species, their race within the species, which is a thing that doesn't exist, but which they tried very much to understand it through. This is the way they tried to understand it. They would very much understand that we would need separate planets, and or that there's just no amount of distance between us that would keep us from hybridizing, because even if I can be morally upright enough not to sully my genetic offspring, which is absolutely not a way yours truly, the Shaggy Dog philosopher, thinks. I was raised very much with an understanding that human perfection would come when we were all brown through racial admixture. And so that's something that I very much carried into my adulthood. I do not believe anything that I'm saying. This is not, but these are things that I have had to argue with, and that I've had to say, well, I like some of what you're saying, but I don't like what that means, and I don't like what that implies. And there's a lot of this that there's a lot of, well, I have no ego, so I have a pile of smashed together ideas that I'm trying to put myself back together with, and a lot of them are very bad and very harmful, and that's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm trying to talk about, and that's what I'm trying to very much to articulate, is that the mystical experience without whatever intelligence is, and without higher intelligence, and without whatever we think we're trying to protect children from by telling them they're smart, is dangerous. Because it seems that the only people that are genetically capable of it, or at least that are biologically, is what I should say, capable of it, seem to be people with seriously broken brains and seriously undeveloped self-conceptions. Seriously undeveloped self-conceptions. And so, if you haven't conceived yourself, and this is where the mystical language gets really interesting and really confusing, and how these arguments can get twisted up and become not Satanist in origin, but what people confuse as Satanist in origin, is if you haven't conceived yourself, you don't really exist. You don't really exist. And so when you say, conceived myself, that seems to mean two things. Because a conception, when we talk biology, is the union of the sperm and the egg cell. Conception is the argument that, pro-lifers make about the sanctity of the human life. Conception is a certain kind of magic when we're talking about biology. And so when we're talking about self-conception, we're talking about an impossible paradox, because you most certainly did not divide your zygote. You most certainly did not make that choice. That is a biological process that happened completely divorced from your pilot you and that indescribable other that seems to occupy the space with you and talk to you sometimes if you're an active listener to yourself or the world around you. And so the question becomes, okay, well, at what point do I start making decisions? And that's what the pro-life. It's so funny. What's the other, pro-choice, but the implication in pro-choice is con-choice, and they're okay with con-choice, but is pro-choice really con-life? And the answer is, yeah, they're against life, they're against conception, they're against potentiality meeting its potential, or even seeing birth to make the attempt, seeing light at all. And in the name of very often in the name of the mother's own pursuit of happiness. Usually, very frequently, I would say more often than half the time, usually to the detriment of a loving father. And now you could stand on your hill all you like, but you don't know what a loving father is like until he's bonded in a shotgun wedding. And that's been the argument that the American culture, the American civilization has made. That's what they used to make to me, that you don't know whether you're ready to have a kid until you have a kid. That was the argument they made, and that's why I talk with my therapist. That's why in the 50s and 60s, you could father 6, 8, 10 kids and then just disappear one day. Because you never know how capable you are until you're not capable anymore. And that's why we say it's irresponsible to undertake things that we don't already know that we're incapable of. But what practice do you get in being a mother in university, in public school? We don't have the giant families and the giant communities that we used to have. Most kids aren't raised in Sunday school anymore. So 10-year-olds don't have opportunities to help raise infants, to change diapers, to be desensitized to motherhood and as small children, so that it's normal by the time they're fertile. And what opportunity did men ever have to be fathers in the ancient world, and even in the pre-modern world before 1950? Why do you think Mad Men happened? That once fathers were expected to be fathers, they all became drunks and had multiple families in different cities. Obviously, that didn't happen to all of them. The drunk thing did. And the answer is complicated. The answer of why is what we're exploring here. The pressure of being not just king in your own home, but enlightened despot in your own home, responsible for the future of wife and children. That is too much to ask. It was too much to ask of the kings of England and of France and of Germany, etc. It was too much to ask of the daimyos of Japan. It was too much to ask of the God Emperor of China. It's too much to ask. We have very little sympathy for boomer men. And boomer men deserve very little. In the same way that I ask, do mass murderers deserve empathy? Mass serial killers, do they deserve empathy? We should be asking every day, do boomers deserve empathy? Because even in the 80s and 90s, you had George Carlin running around saying, fuck boomers. Fuck boomers. But that's so memey and so easy to say. What does it really get us? Cursing the people that came before us, even if Nancy Pelosi is still in office and boomers are still electing her. What does it say about us that we want to just point the finger and we're not running in competition? What Gen Xer is running for Senate? Are they called Gen Xers? No, Gen Xers are my dad. What Gen Zer? What millennial is running for Congress? Who in my generational cohort is doing anything but sucking their thumb and complaining that the most recent Steam release was too expensive? I really want to know, because the people that I see in my age group and younger out in the world trying to affect change are all even more naive, unvisionaries. They haven't had a visionary experience. They're just filling a void. Honestly, they're just imitating their grandparents because their parents are useless. But the question that I get when I say that is, well, why did parents become useless? Because we have these golden age memories of great fathers and great mothers, and we see them on TV, especially if you watch sports. Parents, great, genuinely, truly great parents exist out there in the universe. And so we ask, what happened that mine sucked so fucking bad? And, you know, you can tell me what you want. I'm a crazy person, you know. The only comment that I've gotten on this channel on one of these long form videos that wasn't from someone who knew me personally was a suggestion that rather than do this, I go back to mailing bombs to people, which was hurtful. So I said something hurtful in return that I think was clever and funny, smart, in fact. But there was a conspiracy. And now, again, George Carlin makes the point that made the point in the 90s or the early aughts, you know, made the point before his life was over that when interests align, there doesn't have to be an official backroom conspiracy of conspirators that you can take to court and prove this is the pus of the pimple. Because when interests align and everybody benefits from engaging in the conspiracy, you don't need an official conspiracy. So that's true, and that's the lesson I want you to understand that your government and your corporations and your world leaders have learned from the last 2 centuries. Is that official conspiracies that can be sourced to one person or one cabal of persons can be brought to Nuremberg trials. They can be publicly executed, and they can have their memories used as a curse and as a warning. They can become a logical fallacy. If you don't know what I mean, they can become like the Hitler fallacy, where you win any argument by calling your opponent Hitler. And so one of the things I've been thinking about along those lines, that context of our world leaders aren't learning the same lessons that we are. Because as I've said, what makes me different from you and what makes our world leaders different from us is what they know. And now I know a growing amount of the same things that the world leaders know, but what I don't know is who they know. And you may know who they know, but you don't believe what they know. And now that's a profound thing. So what they do, like the god of Futurama, or maybe the not god of Futurama, is they act in such a way in public and behind closed doors that if they have succeeded in their goals, it looks like no one did anything at all. And the government just, or the society just, or the civilization just, or the culture just, or the religion just became what it became. And there's no source to it, and therefore it's a natural evolution. And stopping the flow of progress is to be anti-progressive. And so what do we have today? We have an argument between progressive liberals and anti-progressive. They're not even conservatives anymore. Anti-progressive centrists. You know, it's interesting to think right wing v left wing in today's politics, because it used to be we had no left wing, we were so right of center. And then in a very short window of time, maybe 6 years, maybe the 2 years before Trump, maybe the 4 years before Trump, and then as a result of the first 2 years of Trump and the catastrophe that was COVID. I know there are 2 years. I know, time's fucky in the way I'm describing it, but I'm thinking about it for the first time. We've become so liberal, I no longer recognize my country. We've become so relativistic toward one another, blind to the differences that make us beautiful, but also ignorant of the qualities that make us the same. You know, in our own ways, chasing our best lives, but without the vision, without any sort of, and I don't even mean a visionary experience. I definitely mean like, you know, just a vision board, like no vision of where we're going, because we're all trying to get where we're going individually. There's no thought to where we're going collectively, and the people that are thinking about steering us in a direction of where we're going collectively, those are the liberal fascists. What amounts to the conservatives, the centrists, are really it's really become just such a ridiculous populist libertarianism, and which is itself a defeated relativistic determinism. You know, liberalism is the idea that if you get sick, it's because you were a bad person, right? And if you get laid off, it's because you deserved it, and that there are no social safety nets and should be no social safety nets for anybody. And you know, it's a rejection of higher thought is what libertarianism is. Libertarianism is a rejection of the idea that the lowest common denominator should be raised, and that makes the whole society better. It lifts us all up toward whatever ineffable goodness, whatever kingdom of heaven can possibly be attained. It's almost an atheistic approach to not even just government, but it's a holistic atheistic approach to everything, and it's almost an anti-theistic approach. It's almost, and it's not even almost. Libertarianism, is definitely. It's definitely a stepping up and a response to Pascal's wager of saying, yeah, well, fuck you and fuck God too. Which, while funny to say, is abhorrent to behave. That's just an abhorrent way to behave. So what that means is the last definition of smart is the reverent, joyous eureka of someone easily solving what is to you an insoluble problem. Oh, that's smart. Yeah, the self-evident, we have to go with that. Suggestion to a difficult choice. It doesn't even have to be a difficult choice. But is that intelligence? I once had a multi-hour argument on a plant. What was it? What were we doing? Whatever. We were in a machine plant. Metalworking. Machining. Arguing with this guy while we were assembling transformer boxes, I believe is what they were. About what intellect is. And what it means to be intelligent. And now, I'm not going to try to straw man his argument because I don't remember exactly what he was arguing, but I didn't like his argument. I thought it was inadequate because basically he was saying that intelligence, oh, here I go, I'm going to straw man it. Basically my memory of his definition of intelligence was the ability to come up with the right answer to a problem, a presented problem. And I said, well, sure, your ability to do a math problem that's presented to you is a skill, but if intelligence is only useful insofar as you're measuring it to talk about, it's not actually a thing, even though you think you're measuring it. Because solving people's problem-solving skills, well, that's not intelligence, that's problem-solving skills. And if intelligence is only problem-solving skills, how is it fair to evaluate children for their problem-solving skills? Because not every child is exposed to problems that it has to solve. And some children are inclined, like I was, to go find problems to solve. And so I guess the hypothesis and what they were thinking was, well, let's those children who make it to first grade and are inclined to have solved problems are going to have problem-solving skills. And so what we're going to say is that intelligence can move up and down based on your environmental factors and your own inclination. And so when I ask the question, how can you think to evaluate children for their ability to be a messiah based on high intelligence scores, but not how did they plan to track them? And was there a plan to track them? Was it more a trickle-down economics kind of thing where they figured that the best of us would just filter to the top and then our biographies would just kind of speak for themselves? And then because we filter to the top, we would make decisions for the people below us that reflected the decision or reflected our environmental and personal factors, and then we would just become like us. Does that make sense? Because that seems to be how free-flowing the idea was. And if the idea came from the kind of people I think it was, these are the kind of people that had never had a visionary experience. They were just trusting people who had had visionary experiences 100 years ago and who had attended a James conference that one time to be smart and to have good ideas. Which means that our decision makers really do trust a remarkably small group of people to make good decisions for us and to have good ideas. And I find that fearsome. I find that frightening, because how were they evaluated? Did they rise to the top, or did they get those jobs because they were friends of the wrong people? And what does it mean if you're the friend of the wrong person, but you got a job that you happen to be good at? Does that mean that it's all relative and that every job, like the relativists say, can be learned over time with patience and an active and attentive will to succeed? That requires a morally higher plane of thought. So in order for Hillary Clinton to have been a good Secretary of State and, for example, not allowed, the bombing at Gaza or whatever, that scandal that with the embassy getting attacked, that wouldn't have happened if she was enlightened. And if she were enlightened, her thought process would have gone something like, how can I make every decision I make that's in the best way for my electorate, but also in the best way for everyone that I engage with as a representative of the United States of America as a god, where you take the United States of America as Hillary Clinton and you elevate the United States of America to godhood, not capital G God, but a lowercase God, somewhere below the sun, but above you. That's the only way that one can make decisions that don't benefit oneself. Is if you take the thing that you're making decisions for and you elevate it above yourself. You hold it as more important even than you. And that's what sacredness is. That's why when Moses found himself in front of the burning bush told him to take his shoes off. You are on sacred ground, sir. Just because you don't know that you're not allowed to drag dead animal parts on the bottoms of your feet on this mountain doesn't mean that you're not actually allowed to drag dead animal parts around on this mountain. You are supposed to be barefoot here. You are not supposed to be here at all. And I've been thinking about that too. Probably talked about it a lot, but sacred spaces used to be sacred for a reason, and there was a reason you couldn't go there. And now if we're talking about the Oracle at Delphi, the reason that space was sacred is because if you go down there and if you go down in those caves unsupervised and you get all high on whatever fumes are coming out of there, you fucking die down there. And so that's what a lot of sacred spaces were, is places that people went and people never came back out of alive. And you're just like, well, just don't go there. People get auto-hypnotized and lost out there. Just don't go. It's just better for you because you're not better than they were. They thought they were just as good as you think you are. You're not coming back. And for a long time, that's what sacrality was. And I've been wondering if there wasn't a cause to that effect. I've been wondering for a long time, because there are a lot of stories in John Keel and John Keel's compendium about experiencers of the other who would have visitations, and the biblical tradition of prophets is very much one of visitation from other beings that call themselves God, or at least representatives of God, right? And one of the things that John Keel talks about is actinic radiation of the eyes. And actinic radiation of the eyes manifests like pink eye. And actinic radiation also manifests as blisters that look like, I believe it's called psoriasis, or like the patchy dry skin that the Bible calls leprosy, but is really just eczema. And one thing that I think we know, because I read that Stephen King book about exposure to nuclear radiation, so just exposure to high degrees of radiating energy, is that you will develop eczema-like patches, if not eczema itself, on your skin. And so one of the things that was associated with going into holy spaces, sacred ground, was actinic radiation and patches on the skin. And one of the things that's associated with being cursed by God for having gone into a sacred space and desecrated it was patches on the skin. And now, the way that modern biblical scholars and historians understand it is that they were blaming ritual unpureness because, yeah, there's like bacteria and stuff in the sand and just in nature out there that will get on your skin, and leprosy is a real problem, and that these things can be avoided with not just ritual bathing, but with regular bathing. And so uncleanness, especially uncleanness in sacred spaces, would really be more about not littering and not despoiling this place that our ancestors liked to come and visit. And very much the same way that Native Americans get upset with hippies today for coming and destroying new growth in their sacred spaces. But then the question that I have is like, okay, but what if, what if ancient religion had figured out how to generate high amounts of electromagnetic energy, and we know that they were capable of it. Now, whether they knew what they were doing and they were doing it on purpose is unsure, but we know via the Baghdad battery that they at least understood the galvanization process. They at least understood how to chemically plate one metal onto another metal. And that's interesting to me because the New Age mysticism that I was exposed to as a child was of the opinion that the canal system that is in fact under the, not canal system, but rather the aquifer, I think is what those are called, like little cavern system that fills with water under the pyramid complex in Giza, Egypt. That tradition was of the opinion that initiates into the highest orders of the Egyptian rites had to swim up into the Great Pyramid through those aquifers, which would have been, according to this telling, infested with crocodiles, and that not being molested and obviously eaten by the crocodiles was a sign of being chosen by the god. And then getting into the temple, and then you would get into the temple, and then you would be ritually whatever, and there would be these ceremonies, yada yada yada, and then you would be led up into the king's chamber, and you would be sealed into the coffin. There's that giant sarcophagus, right? And I've been thinking about that my whole life, because the Magic Egypt and the engineer guy that want to say that the Great Pyramid complex are 20 or 30 or maybe even 60,000 years older than what the archaeologists say it is, and now the archaeologists point to the fact that there's a room that I didn't know about until a couple weeks ago at the top of the Great Pyramid that actually is dated by the builders, and so that seems like pretty good evidence for when it was built. But the let's say they like to call them alternative historians, so took themselves alternative historians. So what the alternative historians what they want to believe is that it's much older, and that sarcophagus was used for magical ritual purposes, and that no one was ever buried in it. And now I'm inclined to believe that no one was ever buried in it, but I'm inclined to believe that the pyramid hadn't been raided or hadn't been bothered by tomb raiders before those Muslims dug out the site or whatever. I'm inclined to believe that, but that doesn't mean it has to be true. That does seem to be what Egyptologists believe, is that Egypt and tomb robbers left those three alone, at least. And now that suggests to me that the folklore was that there were no riches in there was nothing to find, and so leave it alone. And that suggests to me that it was used for ritual purposes. And now I've never really thought about what those ritual purposes are myself until this week, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit here at the end. And we're going to think about what it has to do with what ancient people thought intellect was, and what the soul was, and what the pilot was, and who and what that other occupier with us is. Because I've heard two interesting stories, one old to my life and one very recent, that have got me thinking about this. Now, the old story is that of Magic Egypt. I can't remember the name of that guy, but Magic Egypt holds it that those pyramids are electromagnetically active, that when those aquifers get full, they generate electromagnetic energy, and he points to a photograph of, I think it was Thomas Edison even, holding a light bulb at the apex of the pyramid, and the electromagnetic energy standing his hair on end and lighting the bulb. Now that could be fake, but if it's not, it's compelling evidence for what I'm thinking about. And what I'm thinking about is what demonstrative or performative magic would have looked like in the very ancient world, because we know in the near ancient world that they were using Areopoly or steam engines to animate statues, so that they would do things like you put your coin offering in the bowl and it does something like bow down to you or whatever. Pick up the bowl if there's supposed to be like a libation in it and drink the libation. Like we know that they did this, that they animated statues and they animated doors and they had all kinds of primitive steamworks for their religions, but it didn't really kick off outside of temples. There just wasn't enough money in the economy broadly. And the ancient world, Rome, by this point specifically, was anti-innovation because they had so many bodies to put to work that any kind of automation would have immediately upset their entire social system. Exactly the way the social system was upset by the Industrial Revolution. The difference being the Industrial Revolution had significantly fewer bodies. The plagues that led to the Industrial Revolution had completely depopulated Europe and North America. Quartz, gold, quartzite stone, I should say, gold, and, if I'm not mistaken, the limestone capping that would have been around the Great Pyramid of Giza are all extremely energy conductive. And then I heard this other story about Meiotis Blackburn and how her beloved high priestess and the Tree of Life Yggdrasil of her religion, her cult, the Blackburn cult, which has a stupid long name that I'm never going to even try to remember, something about the 11 hands or whatever. Anyway, when her beloved high priestess Willa died, she embalms her. She coated her skin in some sort of homemade concoction and then stuck her body in what looked like a military footlocker that had been lined in copper. And now that's as far as the story went. That's as far as the storytelling goes. And what's coming next is largely from my imagination. The way that story ends is that when the cops got involved and they exhumed her body out of the floorboards of her parents' house, and they opened that box, there was very little decay 3 years later. She looked lifelike, but she was pale and her skin looked like a porcelain doll. And I got to thinking about my knowledge of chemistry and my knowledge of that time period in general, I think that was the 1930s, 1920s. And I got to thinking and I got to wondering, why the hell copper? Why the hell copper? Because one of the things that people that tell these stories about weird people or cultists or whatever is they don't try to, and this is why I'm asking the question, should we empathize with them? They don't try to ask, well, why did they do that? Like, what was the efficacy or what was the effect that they were trying to get? What? We know what she was trying to do. She thought she could bring that girl Willa back to life. Well, what do we know about 1920? We know that there had been, in the previous century, traveling galvanizing shows where they would electrocute dead bodies and make them jerk and jump around. They would do it to frogs, and it would look like they would get up and dance. And so we knew that electricity had something to do with what was going on with us in this living body, and so we didn't know that the way it works is that the brain and the spine and the yada yada and the da 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 da, right? But they understood there was something going on there. And Egyptomaniacs of the 1880s and the early 1900s were convinced there was something to the mummification process. Meiotis Blackburn was obviously an Egyptomaniac. She had in a previous profession prior to her visionary rebirth been a Egyptian dancer. I guess that even happened that was part of her cult, was that she knew all the old Egyptian magic dances, right? So she's clearly an Egyptomaniac, and they believed some fucking weird stuff about their abilities with electromagnetism, which is why I'm not allowed to talk about them today without being called a crazy person. But I'm okay with you thinking me a crazy person, and maybe it makes me more entertaining. I certainly think life is more entertaining from the way I'm viewing it. And so the copper, I got to thinking, like, why copper? What is it about copper? Why would she have lined her coffin with copper? And then I got to thinking about it, and I was like, what if the reason that girl's skin looked like porcelain is because whatever they put on her body, they also coursed electricity through and literally galvanized or fossilized her skin? Now, I can't know, and we won't get any more of the story than what's in that one book by, I believe his name is Charles Fort. We don't get any more of the story than that, and no one's revisited it, and definitely no one's opened her coffin like they used to do for just saints in general in the Middle Ages. One of the folk beliefs about saints in the Middle Ages is that their bodies didn't decompose, so they would keep them in open air caskets and their bodies wouldn't decompose. And that was one of the ways that you could know that this was the true faith and this was the right way, is because the faith was so strong that the body remained intact, waiting on the second coming, because they genuinely and truly believed that those bodies were getting back up. And so what that means is that May Otis Blackburn genuinely believed that that little girl was getting back up someday. They put her in those floorboards because they thought whatever they had done to her, or whatever they had planned to do to her, or whatever they planned to figure out to do to her, was going to make her get back up. And I wonder if, because one of the things that I've noticed is that as much as modern historians want us to believe that ancient ideas that went away certain ancient ideas, for example, e.g. Gnosticism, Christian Gnosticism, went away just because their books stopped circulating in regular circulation, right? They got burned or they became lost to history, that their ideas were also lost to history. And what keeps being proven over and over, and I've even said it in this space, does it make sense that it's a coincidence that Aleister Crowley was able to accurately recreate first century Gnosticism, and then in his lifetime, or no, just shortly after his lifetime, the actual books of the first century Gnostics were found? I don't think that's coincidence. I think the books never went out of circulation. I just think the bloodstream through which they were pumping was a much smaller body. Much, much fewer people had access to those books than people want you to believe, but they never went anywhere. And if the books never went anywhere, the ideas never went anywhere, and the books they were writing the ideas down in just never made it into popular circulation. And we know this because of some of the evil outgrowths of what I'm talking about. When you talk about book that I haven't read, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I think is what it's called. I need to read it, but I haven't because it's evil. What if it's right? What if it's right? And see, the answer is, well, you don't stop being not anti-Semitic just because that book is kind of right. And that's the correct answer. But also, what if it's right? Like, what are the other things? What are the other things that we have to take out of it, right? There's a lot of the 20th century and a lot of post-1950 that we have to throw away if it's right. Now, I don't think it's going to be right, and I don't think it is right a priori. I just assume that it was evil and written for an evil intention and an evil outcome that it did get. But, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me, right? And so what if they were able to to the perspective of the onlooker and the religious pilgrim, what if the ancient Egyptians were able to summon lightning storms that hit those pyramids during high tide, and those full aquifers, and that limestone-capped pyramid, the tallest building in the world at the time, with the gold cap on the top, and lightning storms already being in a species-old form in which the God of all gods, the God of being, expresses itself. What if we understood that the way our body worked was with electrical impulses long before anyone would ever admit that we did? Because you can listen to Richard Dawkins today say that when Jordan Peterson talks about wondering whether ancient people hadn't had mystical experiences that led them to understand the double helix nature of DNA, that he thinks he's just talking mystical sounding, smart sounding bullshit. I think Richard Dawkins is a dumb fuck, because the mystical experience has proven to, well, fuck, the DNA was discovered on LSD. So suggesting that ancient people figured it out before us is just suggesting what always is true, that ancient people knew so much more than we give them credit for. Which means they were smarter and they were more intelligent than we give them credit for. And that leads us closer to figuring out exactly what intelligence is. Thank you for listening. This has been the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. You've been listening to the Shaggy Dog Philosophy Podcast. I'll talk to you again soon.